Thank you, guys. So thank you for inviting me here. It's a pleasure to be among all of these great women. And I enjoyed the previous presentation. It's a perfect segue for me to be in between MEM sessions and Azure sessions. So thanks for that. And yeah, my name is Nina Desnica. I'm a program manager within Microsoft Endpoint Manager team. It's a customer acceleration team, which means that we work also with customers and help them deploy Microsoft Endpoint Manager, and also look and to learn from them to build in some of the cool stuff in our product. So I'm coming from the MEM team, MEM group, but today I'm gonna be talking about mix of things. So we have Azure DevOps, we have Microsoft Graph and Microsoft Endpoint Manager. And this session is going to be art of the possible. I really like these kind of sessions because they bring up all of these different approaches that are maybe not that popular, or they're not popular yet, and bring some new ideas that anyone can really use. So I really don't have more about myself, but maybe we can just keep it open. And in case you have any questions, obviously feel free to unmute. This is a community event, which I love, so don't hesitate. Okay. So let's see what we will cover today. So the first thing I would like to do is a quick overview of the key components that I mentioned, which are Microsoft Endpoint Manager first, Azure DevOps as a second, and finally Microsoft Graph, which is inevitable key component for today's session. After that, we're gonna see how all of these three items are bringing all together, and why we need these three and what we want to achieve. And finally, I'm gonna walk you through some of the common scenarios that might be useful for this kind of approach, and that I have seen throughout working with customers that might be a good idea for automation. So let's start with why are we here and how we came up with this at all. So what we have seen while working with various different customers that are using M365 services, regardless of is it Microsoft Endpoint Manager, or if it's Azure, or if it's like Office, they often have some business needs that are not easily addressed on various portals, but they go beyond that. And Microsoft really enables us to maybe fill this gap by surfacing Microsoft Graph, that really provides an easy way to track these parts and components, and it gives us possibility to build a custom solution that will do something that we might need. Now, when talking about the custom solution and the automation in general, I'm always careful because there are tons of different ways that this will be maybe overdoing stuff. So we do want to do this and invest this work into this work when it really makes sense, when there's some repetitive tasks or something that we want to have structured or controlled. So this is where we recognize the need for this approach maybe. And today, my idea with this session is to help determine how we do access Graph, how we can use the Graph to do these certain things like automating some of the policy creation or items like that. And also how now Azure DevOps, which brings into this picture, is complementing this, because I know that automation it has definitely been around, PowerShell scripts not even to mention, but what value we're actually getting from having Azure DevOps in this trio. And finally, this session is art of the possible. It is based on specific scenarios from the industry, so it's very real. But again, what I'm going to show you today is a solution that it's showing what are the possibilities, potentially give you some ideas how you can use it, but it's not like a full product or a package that you will go ahead and pick and create. It's just there to show you what our options we have and how we can mix these three things in one. Okay, we will start with basics first. Obviously, I assume that within this group we know a lot about the various Microsoft technologies, but I don't like to assume, especially as I'm mixing three things. I will just do a super quick overview of all of the key components that I need, so that later when I show some of the demos, everything is clear for everybody from the call. So again, this will be the quickest one because Microsoft Endpoint Manager has been around for a while. It is a unified platform, including both Config Manager and MS Intune that we use, or all the IT pros are using, to manage all devices, keep them secure, updated, and it's really covering all platforms across the board, from Windows, Mac, iOS, Android. So we are really looking at the full stack here, and this is obviously something that probably most of us have seen, or in general IT pros that are working with the clients in the organization. This is like the work environment. This is the dashboard that they will look every day, and this is the place where they would create the policies, manage all these devices. I'm not going to go through all the nodes, but this is just the focus for today, is that we are going to focus on the automating tasks on this dashboard without even actually going here and clicking on the UI. That's the goal for today. So I think that was fairly quick. For the DevOps piece, when I was asked, like very often, like what is DevOps, or how do we define DevOps? That's a very tricky question to answer, because it really depends who do you ask. It can be really like anything from this, what you've seen is here. It can be using automation. It can be small deployments. That's one of my favorite ones. It can also be infrastructure as code. This is very usual for Azure infra folks, because they are using Azure DevOps for mostly deploying infrastructure in Azure. It can be really anything from here, and it really depends who do you ask. But what the truth is that Azure DevOps is essentially all of these things. So it's okay to define it as you like. If I would have to pick one thing, or say in one sentence what the DevOps is, I would say it's a union of people, process, and products in order to continually deliver the value to the users. And one of the, I guess it's a buzzword, but you have probably heard it before, is CI/CD, or continuous integration, continuous delivery, which is the key concept of the DevOps approach. And essentially this diagram on the right represents it very nicely. We would start from planning and tracking anything, like any kind of project, or let's say an application, or anything that has something to do with code or not. Then we would work on developing that. After that, we will build and test to make sure it does build first, and then also that the tests are successful. And only after that, we're going to deploy this to our environment. And after that, we're going to focus on operating and monitoring. And then we would go again and add more stuff. But the whole idea of DevOps is to keep this confidence that you have always a working solution. You always have that one master branch that contains a code that is healthy, that builds, and that is going to not break, obviously. So this is the concept of DevOps in general for everybody who didn't have a chance to hear about it before. And now maybe from Microsoft lens, what we have that embraces this concept is Azure DevOps. So Azure DevOps is a platform that has various components that we use in order to help people practice that approach, if that makes sense, and also track a certain project from its beginning until the end. So the key components that we have are Azure boards. So Azure boards essentially is the place where we have all our tasks. This is a favorite place for a PM or a product owner, which has all of these tasks, and it tracks all of the rituals that are based on the DevOps or agile approach. And the second item is Azure pipelines and repos, which are key components for me today because I'm going to use these two. So pipelines are, I would like to describe as like the engine that helps us drive our solution. So if we prepare certain code or scripts or something, we want to have something that will orchestrate this and add a bit more or like richer features around that. You will see in a couple of minutes. And then we have the second most important one is obviously Azure repos. This is the place where we store the code. This is the place where we organize the structure for example, any kind of files and folders we're gonna have. We're gonna use this, even though it doesn't have to be Azure repo. It can also be a GitHub or anything like that you normally use. And finally, we have Azure task plans and Azure artifacts. So task plans we use in DevOps for managing all the testing and being on top of things when it comes to testing. And our Azure artifacts are there for when you have solution that it's ready, that you're happy with it. Let's say you're deploying new policy and you're fully tested, you're super happy with how it looks like. You might want to package this into an artifact and then publish on a certain feed when somebody can really just grab it and include in their solution within the team or your organization. So that's why we have, it's like a packaged solution. So that's the overview of the components. And in case you want to see how it looks like, this is my Azure DevOps tenant. So here I have dashboards. This is the place for a product owner that he can track, or anybody, like what's going on. Then we do have a backlog, which is a place for all the tasks and different items like stories, etc. We have Azure repos, where we have all, now in my case, I have all my policies here, folders for different automations that I tried or prepared over the past period in this environment. And then branches, obviously, for continuous integration. Pipelines, we have here some of the pipelines that I created for executing solutions, releases to various deployments. We're going to look into all of these things, but this is just a quick overview. This is the feed that I talked about, where you do see all of these different packaged solutions that then someone can use. So that would be Azure DevOps in a nutshell, if I would have to show to someone. And now moving on to a key component. Without this, we wouldn't be able to do any automation, which is Microsoft Graph. So Microsoft Graph is unified REST API. It's a single endpoint that gives us ability to reach any other services or endpoints behind that. It gives us possibility to very easily navigate from one part to another. And if we are creating some automation, we are going to need different endpoints, different objects, and then connection to the next item. So Microsoft Graph has been around also for quite a bit, but for the sake of the later demo, I'm going to show something that I really like. When somebody asks me how you would describe Graph in one picture, this is what I would show. So we are starting from one node. It can be really anything from what you're seeing here. And then you can move to different stuff. For example, I'm starting from me, and I can move to different reports and then content of these reports. So those are these transitions, how I move from one object to another. We can make this even bigger and add a bit more pivots here that I can move along with. And we can really do this almost forever. But the whole point of this, or what I would like to remember from this slide, is essentially that we are accessing various pieces of data based on what we need and what we're trying to do by using Graph. And how do we do that? We are doing that by calling different APIs. So I already said we do have one single endpoint, which is graph.microsoft.com. And this is the place where we start. Then after that, we're adding a version of, it can be V1 or beta version of the graph API, and then we're adding a resource of what are we actually going to access. Based on the previous slide, it can be really anything that you have seen there, like groups, users, drives, devices, for example. It can be really anything. And after that, we can add a specific ID that will bring me only one of those resources. So for example, I'm going to pick users and then user Nina, and then I can actually take any property of that object, of that user, for example, department where Nina works, or member of, which gives me also all of different groups where Nina is member of. And then we do have query parameters for anyone who used any kind of query language before. It's quite fairly common that we do have all of these formatting commands and controlling items that we can use in order to specify this result, that it makes sense or that it brings us exactly the data that we need. So at the end of the day, this is how the graph call looks like. The complete one that, for example, gives me only user, that filters throughout all the users and gives me the one that's specific by UPN Bob, for example, Bob tenant. So that was how the call looks like. And now what we can do with that, now when we access the right item, there's a bunch of options that we can use to either like load or get some data, or even post or update something from the background. So there are get, post, put, patch, and delete. Maybe I think it's self-explanatory, but I will just point out that get and delete are requests that do not require any body, because we are just grabbing the data or deleting something, but the other items will require a body with the data that we are about to change in the backend. So we are using JSON format for that. And the JSON is a key value pair of the data structure that we are about to patch or add. So in this case, it's a user with all of these properties and defined values for that. So that was a quick refresher for JSON. Now, if you want to explore Microsoft Graph further, I think a couple of months ago, we did a nice session that covered all different ways how you can actually explore Graph. One of the options is Graph Explorer. That's a super easy way, browser-based, that you can just play with the different APIs, play with different queries, try to add or remove some data, probably not remove for just exploring. The next one is obviously Web Dev Tools. So it's probably the easiest one. So if you go to your MEM dashboard and in your browser, you go to Developer Tools, you are going to look into the network, and there you will be able to see all of these HTTP requests with the JSONs, with graph calls. It's very interesting to understand what happens in the background as you are clicking on the UI. So highly recommend, in case you didn't do it, to go ahead and do it. And also this is super handy for obviously, when you're thinking about the automation or automating different pieces, you want to know what is the endpoint name, or when I'm clicking on the group of users, or when I'm clicking on the policy, how is that resource called? So this is a great place where you can grab that and see what's the truth, what's happening when you're clicking on that item. Then we have PowerShell. Obviously, for PowerShell, there are two options. We do have PowerShell Gallery that was created by our colleague Dave Falkus, who prepared a bunch of samples for anyone to use and not start from scratch, but from some of the samples and some of the code that was built there. And also the second option is you can also use Microsoft commandlets that are built into Intune module. So we do have a module with a lot of commandlets that you can just run and play or explore Graph through that way. And finally, Power Platform, why not? A great solution to build low-code apps. by using Power Apps and Power Platform. You can also use and explore Graph via automation through Power Platform. So in case you want to learn more or see some demos how this can be done, I'm going to link the session underneath where we showed a bunch of examples. Today, we're going to focus on the DevOps only. Before we do that, I would just like to look at the architecture, because when we are mixing these many things, it might be confusing what we are trying to show and how do we approach automation and where this sits in this whole view. So starting from the top layer, this is a place where admin would start or IT pro would start. You're looking at your Microsoft Endpoint Manager dashboard. You have your workloads there, you have your devices, apps, and you are actually interacting with the UI, right? And very similarly on the AD side, you are also opening Azure portal, and you are looking at your users or groups, and you're interacting with the UI. What is happening in the backend as you click, there are a bunch of different graph calls being made in the background. And actually, we do have a single endpoint that I already said that depends now on what you clicked or what you're asking for, which resource is going to bring some of the specific service endpoints. So for example, if I'm going to click on the device compliance, I'm going to be grabbing policy provider via mid layer, which is graph that is then contacting a specific endpoint. And very similarly for AD, if you're manipulating groups or clicking on or creating groups, let's say, you're going to access, again, graph.microsoft.com, which will then go ahead and reach out a specific group, a specific item or endpoint that is in charge of what you're trying to access. So when we talk about the automation, or in general, automation doesn't have to be via DevOps. It can be through PowerShell or anything like that. We are actually starting from the mid layer. We are going to create a script or a solution or something like that, or essentially the Graph API call that will go directly in the middle, and then it will change or update the data in the backend, and then that will be surfaced on the final layer. So we are not going to go to the Microsoft Endpoint Manager by directly to the backend, if that makes sense. So this is what we are what we are going to do, and now I think it's the time to move on to the most fun part. How do we bring all these pieces together? So we have seen Microsoft Endpoint Manager, which we know very well. Then we had a chance to see Azure DevOps, or learn about the DevOps concepts, and see a bit of a dashboard of what we can do and what items we have there available for us to think about that and use it for automation. And then we also had a chance to see Microsoft Graph. That is essential part of how we are doing automation of MEM. And now let's see how we will now mix all of these three to achieve so a custom solution or automation. So we have three steps or three pieces. The first one is we need to create MS Graph and PowerShell scripts. So again, when I say create, it can be, you can leverage the existing ones. You might have your own already that you have been developing, so you can just use those. Or you can just create a new one from scratch by using the API documentation and testing a little bit. So this is the number one that we will need. After that, we need to use Azure DevOps pipeline in order to run that script. So this is something that is coming next as a next step. And finally, we are going to deploy that configuration to Microsoft Endpoint Manager. So we need the script, we need a pipeline and the Azure DevOps setup, and then we need to deploy this configuration by running it. And now you are probably asking me, that's all great, but where do I start? How do I decide? If I decide today, I like the story, I like the idea, where do I supposed to start, and how I'm gonna build all of these things. So let's break it down to where to start. So we're gonna start, like I said, the automation piece, and I already mentioned the famous PowerShell Intune samples that you can leverage. If you go to this link, you will be seeing a lot of different samples that you can use for looking at, first of all, grabbing these scripts, and then of course using it for your automation testing. But it's very important to look inside of those, or you can just start with some of the scripts that you already have or you already possess. So that's the number one. I think that's the easiest step because it's already there. You just need to use it. In this case, I'm going to pick, for example, compliance policy. And inside, I do have, again, like the whole overview of the script. And it's very important to go and validate what is inside, what the script is doing with the knowledge of Graph or Graph API, being able to locate where are these Graph API calls. So in this case, I picked the compliance policy add PowerShell script, which actually creates the new compliance policy in MEM. And if you scroll down, you will be able to see this part, which is essentially the part where Graph API call was made. So you will probably recognize now all of these things that I talked about. So we need a JSON, which is a format of what policy we are adding. We are providing a version of Graph API. Here is 1.0. We are grabbing a specific resource. So this time it won't be users Nina. It's going to be device management, device compliance policies. And finally, at the end here, you will see where is this famous call being made with all the headers, authentication token, and type of the method, and of course the body of the policy that we are adding. Maybe one important thing to mention here is that we need for all of these samples, this will be a friendly advice to go ahead and edit some pieces that are requiring user interaction. When we talk about the pipelines, this is executing on who knows which machine. So you want to make sure that you remove all of this interaction with the user who's authenticating, because we want to deploy this as an application authentication token, not as a specific user who will type the password or God know hard code the password in the code. So this is the first, for example, thing that you would need to modify in case you're using samples. But yeah, this is where you would start. The second part is, how do I set up my Azure DevOps so that I'm able to spin these scripts in? So you would start with creating repos and structures. Structure, obviously, this depends on your style, on what you like, but there are some maybe my personal recommendations. Branches, obviously, at least have at least 2 master and dev branches so that you're sure that you always have a healthy code that builds, that it's not going to fail. Install Git on your PC from where you're creating this and clone in a VS Code or environment of your choice. This will help you commit this much faster in case you're collaborating with other people. This comes super handy and it's much more natural. In case you don't want to do that, you can still do everything in the browser. That's totally okay. You just don't have some of the features that some environments provide. And then you are going to create the pipelines and start testing. So let's look into each of these. So create repos and structure. This is what I would recommend to start with. It's super simple. It can be added more things, but let me walk you through what we are trying to do here. So the first thing, we need this famous script that we already learned where it is, how we can grab it, add it, and we're going to add it to our repository. That's the script that does what you need it to do. Then we need a configuration file, which is a JSON file where you provide all the data that this script needs. This gives you the chance to, for example, keep your environment information in the JSON file. So when you're deploying to different tenants, you can use the same module, same script. You can just switch between different configuration files with different 2 tenants information. Then you need obviously the pipeline, which is orchestration of how you're doing. How are you running? What goes first? What goes second? Do you have any triggers? We're going to look into pipeline later. And there's the fourth one, which is a public artifact. This is optional, obviously, but this is just a reminder in case you want a package solution that can be reused by someone else later on. You can use the publish artifact pipeline that you're going to create, and then it will publish this on this feed where I showed you before. Just a reminder that in case there are some questions, just feel free to unmute or to interrupt me. Create pipelines. I figured from the feedback from before that this might be the trickiest part or the most unknown part of the whole piece. So you can create pipelines in two ways. You can create a pipeline as code, which is a sample on the right, where you do have this YAML file where you do the orchestration. You need to just be careful about all the spaces and the structure, but you can use the sample and just build on top of that. In case you don't like that, you can start first with the UI where you will click through. I'm going to show both examples, and then you are able to create your pipeline that actually triggers a script that runs. Okay, so then now it's the most interesting part. I'm gonna walk you through scenarios. We have two interesting scenarios. The first one is deploy compliance policy to test and prod, or it can be any policy, but since we use the compliance policy for the previous items, we're gonna just continue with that. Then the second scenario will be that we are going to deploy baseline configuration to multiple new mem tenants. This is something that definitely saves a lot of time, and I think both examples are interesting because they are bringing this automation piece and plus some of the Azure DevOps super nicely that will provide you ability to deploy this super fast and add even some more flavor to it. You will see now. So let's start from the scenario one. So I'm an IT pro. I would like to deploy compliance policy to test tenant first automatically. I don't want to mess up with automation in my production tenant. I don't want to be fired, so I will start from the test environment. And then after I'm successfully deploy that, and I'm super happy with how my policy looks like in the test environment, I feel super confident now to move to my production tenant. And then I'm going to do exactly the same thing that I'm going to deploy to a different tenant. I think this is a pretty common scenario and something that maybe we will have potentially one more step like QA in between, but this is normally what it's a good practice to do for all of the policies. Again, this underneath that you see, that's actually a pipeline in a visual representation. So you have seen before like YAML, which is like code of pipeline. This is a UI. So if you like this, you can also create this maybe for the first time in a visual way. And there are key components of this. We have artifacts, which is actually the code from which we are building a solution. So there I would put my Azure repository with all of the files that I need for this solution. And then I have two stages. Obviously, first one that spins up the deploy compliance policy in test tenant. The second one does the same, but for production tenant. So now I'm going to show a quick demo how this looks like. So we are starting from my test tenant where I don't have any compliance policies. This is my production tenant where I have only one compliance policy. I'm just starting with my work. So I'm going to go back to my Azure DevOps dashboard, and this is that very same pipeline that I showed. Here I linked all the artifacts, which is this Azure repository into automation. Then as a first stage, I have deploy test. Here I added something that's interesting. I added me as an approver when this first step completes that I'm approving it. And I'm going to hit now create to start this release. And now we're going to follow what is going to happen. So you see now that I manually triggered this pipeline, and now it's going into the first stage, and it's going to deploy my compliance policy in the test environment. You will see here how quickly this happens. Obviously, it's there are two policies, actually iOS and Android, but one job, one task, very, very fast. And after this is completed, I'm gonna go ahead and first of all validate if this actually deployed policies. So I'm gonna hit refresh and see my two compliance policies there deployed from the pipeline. Now I'm gonna examine like if everything is fine, just to validate if the policies are okay and if this is what I wanted. And after that, I'm gonna go back to my environment. I'm gonna say I'm approving this, compliance policies are successfully deployed. I'm happy to move to prod because I'm happy with how it deployed to test. And then I'm gonna hit approve. And now my pipeline will continue to the next stage, which is deploying that same compliance policy in my production environment. And here I will see that this is successfully completing. And in, again, a fraction of time, you can have the policy deployed, the same one that you validated, or actually the two in my production tenant. So now this process is going to complete, and I'm going to go back to my production tenant just to validate that these two policies really applied. And yes, that's the case. So I'm happy with the result. And this is a demo of how actually you can deploy in a pipeline deployment in test and prod. Again, this is a super simple like task. Imagine now that you're deploying, I don't know, 10 different policies or different workloads. You will just stack up on the tasks on each of these stages, or you want to make something in between, that's also fine. What I would like to highlight here are some of the key components that I already mentioned that brings a lot of value when we're doing this from the Azure DevOps. So the first one is this piece here. It's continuous deployment trigger. In case you're changing your script all the time, you don't need to manually trigger the script. It will look into whenever master branch was updated successfully, it will trigger automatically the pipeline. This obviously makes sense when you're like working on a solution or you want this to happen. You can obviously enable and leverage this. The second piece are gates. Before and after each of these stages, you can create a approver in case something is deployed in test and you want, I don't know, a manager or somebody to validate if it's fine, or a test team. You will add them as approvers here, and they will be able to check if that's okay or not. And then you can also do triggers between as well, before, after, so that you have a full control of what's going on. If you need some manual checks in between, you're not happy with everything automated, you can add them there and make sure that's validated. Finally, scheduling. You can obviously schedule a pipeline to run automatically on a pace or that you like. For example, in case you're having a pipeline that is collecting some audit files or monitoring or does something that needs a cadence, you can obviously do that by scheduling release trigger. So the next scenario I wanted to talk about still stands everything that we highlighted from the pipeline perspective. You see it as well here, is deploy baseline configuration to multiple new tenants. So you can have 1, 2, 3, 10 different tenants, depends on what you're trying to do. And imagine that today you're starting with all blank tenants and somebody tells you, oh, you need to go ahead and create some baseline configuration. What do I mean by baseline configuration? Like policies, applications, app protection policies, a bit of everything, let's say. And if you need to do it more than 5 times or 3 times manually, all of those, it really sums up to a lot of work. So this is also a very good example where you want to leverage automation, and there is a way how you can do it with Azure DevOps. On the right side, I do have example of a pipeline that looks a bit different than the previous one, because this one has one stage only. We're deploying directly to the tenant, no test tenant, and we have multiple tasks for each of these tenants. Of course, it really depends how many agents you have. You can have how many you like. And now I'm going to show how the demo looks like for deploying these to one tenant that it's a blank at the beginning. So again, we are starting from completely empty tenant. We don't have anything here, no apps, no policies. I'm just going to go ahead now and show that indeed we don't have any compliance policies, any apps validate that. And now I'm going to run the pipeline that it's a YAML file. It's not going to be this visual pipeline. It's going to be like execution of the YAML file. And you are going to see how this executes in the backend and what we are executing. So I'm deploying the new environment, which means I have a couple of categories. There are four things that I'm doing here. I'm deploying first device configuration, I'm deploying then device compliance, then I'm deploying apps, and finally I'm deploying app protection policies. But before I go through these scripts, I'm checking obviously some of the nugget security analysis, loading all the artifacts that I need. And now you will see how fairly quick this actually deploys. Finally, app protection policies. And now this is already deployed in my tenant. So now I will switch back to my tenant just to show you or to validate if this actually happened. So I'm gonna go ahead and refresh this, and we will see there are my policies deployed. If I switch back to configuration profiles, here they are. And if I go back to applications, there they are, my apps. And finally, app protection policies, if I hit refresh, these are there, so that's all good. Okay, so that was an example how you can deploy it in one tenant. You can obviously include, like I said, many configuration files, deploy it to various tenants, and it's a super easy way when you need to spin off a new environment which has no data in it, and an easy way to do it. Again, if you need to like update it. Finally, one important thing to mention, how to make this even easier, is the Teams integration. So if you like, you can integrate Azure DevOps to your Teams so that all of these things, or most of these things that I showed, like approving things or picking up tasks in the DevOps, you can do it from Teams directly. That's super nice. You can receive notification on Teams when your pipeline is starting, or if the pipeline needs assistance. There is a separate integration for Azure pipelines just for that reason. So in case you decide to use this approach, this comes super handy that you do not need to go to almost any tenant, any environment. You can do it directly from Teams, which is really, really cool. Okay, so to conclude this session for today, what we have seen is how Microsoft is providing Graph to expose different components that we can use to automate or manipulate with the data behind any of the M365 services, including Microsoft Endpoint Manager. So in case something is not on the portal and it does make sense to automate because you're doing it multiple times, Microsoft Graph is something you need, plus obviously PowerShell, plus Azure DevOps if you like. So in this session, we have seen how we can actually use these three to automate Microsoft Endpoint Manager tasks. And actually, where is this value of using Azure DevOps? It's a different lens to automate stuff, but there are a bunch of different items that you can use, like gates, triggers. You can use this continuous integration, continuous delivery, so that you're absolutely sure that what you're deploying is always healthy while you're changing the versioning of the other items to make sure it's doing okay. And when you merge it, it's gonna build again. So this is also something that gives value by adding Azure DevOps into this. And finally, don't forget that this session showed the art of the possible. This is not a like recommended way we should everything do like automation plus the DevOps, but definitely there are some specific scenarios where automation just makes sense. It just provides ability to save some time, deploy something on scale up, and it can be a valid option. So in that case, I hope this session today gave you a bit of ideas or inspired you to at least explore some of these items. So with that, I'm gonna thanks for attending and as open for any question or whenever that's needed back to our dear organizers.
So Nina, this is Holly. That was a wonderful session. I remember when Dave Falkus first started that, and I just sent him a message letting him know that you nailed this. It was a great overview of what each of the services are and then how you kind of pull it all together as like a story feel and then provided the live demo. So you should feel really proud of the work that you did today.